Not writing anything yet, but sort of contemplating the possibility of getting involved in writing a manual for the state of Vermont, because Vermont just passed a complete streets law. And I'd be interested in hearing y'all's thoughts on the potential difficulties involved in writing a complete streets manual that would be intended to span small city all the way to completely rural.
I think you can, the manual that we have really covers a lot of that. I mean, the principles are in there. What I would suggest in your case, we are in a more urban context, and I've had a number of people ask me, it's at the Walk 21 conference, I give a presentation, and somebody asked, well, what about rural streets or cities? We didn't do anything on rural. We did a little bit, but if I were to expand on it in that context, I'd say, take what we started with, and just add some text, if it be a whole chapter or maybe just really a section on rural context. I think what we've got is it's 80, 90% there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And that's kind of how we intended it to be, as a template that if you follow the principles, most everything's there, and you can just kind of add to it as needed.
There are some other manuals. I think Oregon had a sort of main street when a highway runs through it, and I know New Jersey wrote some sort of highway through Main Street things, and Vermont actually has some projects I know where you've dealt with sort of highways through main streets, and so I think it's probably all out there. Just need to kind of put it together. Any other?
Yeah, what would y'all say is the most valuable contribution that, like, the departments of planning and zoning in these urban areas can make to the development of the streetscape designs? Because we're kind of looking at the transportation and land use connection. Where would they be most valuable in helping you create the design?
Find a way that you can get involved with the transportation people in your jurisdiction, because there still is this issue that they're sort of speaking different languages, and often what we found in projects that we're doing where we're implementing is that if it's the transportation or public works department that's doing the project, it can be really difficult to get people from the land use side involved because they have nothing to charge their time to. So find a way to get your jurisdiction to understand that just because it is a transportation project that the land use folks have to be involved, and then sort of vice versa. Figure out a way that you can really engage the public works and the transportation departments.
What are examples of those ways?
And I was really looking for to engage the transportation people is like curb to curb. But outside of that, a lot of it is planning and zoning realm. So what can they contribute to help you with the connection between improved multimodal transportation and what happens outside of
it's getting the rules for the context to support what the rules for the street are trying to do. It's sort of this thing, and this was this constant debate in preparing the CNU manual, was ITE manual, is there were people from CNU who were saying basically, if the community doesn't want to make the commitment to having the place right, then they just shouldn't be allowed to do this stuff, and they're all sinners and they can live in whatever environment they're going to live in. And that's where I think what Ryan's talking about saying, well, this range of the way that you deal with the pedestrian environment, there's always the minimum, and ADA, the new ADA rules are going to help with this. It's like, no, you at least have to provide for the pedestrian. And so that gets towards every street is then multimodal, but if there is an interest in the community, and And we see this, it can be really challenging when we're doing one of these projects and the city hasn't been having the dialogue about land use. But that being said, there are a number of projects that we've done where we've looked at redesigning the street, and then as part of the project, we're changing the land use regulations. And those are really sort of the best projects, particularly for major streets, because there are a lot of issues that you have to deal with if you come up with all of these great designs for pedestrians and the buffer, and then there's a parking lot and the building's 100 feet back from the roadway. It's still better, but it's not really achieving the full goal.
This really gets to that issue that I said that I believe the DNA of urban form rests in two places. One is in your street design, which is probably housed in your manuals and standards. And the other is your land use planning, which is your general plan, your zoning, your specifics plans, and building codes and all that. And it's really the intersection of those two is what you're asking about. We have one chapter in our manual that deals with that, how the land use interfaces with the streets. But it's important that you get both sides talking, first of all. I mean, in our city, in LA, and it varies from city to city, the planning department is now the one that's taking the lead on redesigning the streets, or, kind of revamping the street codes and all that. That's a better scenario. So you don't have like the transportation engineers doing the streets and the land use planners just doing the land use. So, I mean, if you can have certainly the planning department doing both, then there's a lot more to build on. And then last, I would just say that you could, if this is a particular issue in your community, you could take that chapter that we have on the interface between land use and the street and expand on that however makes sense.
I have a question related to equity, and I believe it was in LA that you specifically called out equity as one of the part of the vision. And I'm wondering, and I'm thinking of the example given in San Francisco where you said they're going to be doing more enforcement related to business owners maintaining the adjacent right-of-way and the sidewalk and all that that involves. What are some of the equity issues that these street designs may have raised, and how have you dealt with those?
There's several that I can think of. I mean, starting with universal access issues, making sure that the city is designing for people of all physical abilities and ages, I think is a real equity issue. I mean, it's a civil rights issue. So that's one to start with. But I can think of a couple cases in LA where this is coming up, where, for example, the city and the Metro want to put a bus lane on Wilshire Boulevard. And we're putting a bus lane on Wilshire Boulevard. There were a couple neighborhoods, high income neighborhoods, that said, okay, everywhere, but just exempt our neighborhood. And it undermines the value of having the bus lane continuous. And the city caved and was worried about these people suing. So they said, okay, just in your neighborhood, we're not going to have the bus lane. Or similarly, we've got another place, we're trying to put a bike boulevard that connects all the way from we're mid-city to downtown, and that goes through all kinds of neighborhoods. It goes through one wealthy neighborhood, and they, don't want the features that make this bike boulevard work well through their neighborhood. And I think that's kind of it's an equity issue that comes up. And I think you make your best, the way you deal with it, I think, is you make your best case for trying to design for all people. I'm actually offering the city council member in that area to do a charrette where we include both the residents in that area as well as the bicycle interest to try to come up with a design that works for both. And I think we can probably do something like that.
Well,
I can certainly, if you want me to. I mean, the two things that come up for me on the subject, I mean, in terms of what we're trying to provide, I mean, the term equity really wasn't ever an objective, but I think a couple of us were talking after I presented about the role of choice in this, and at least in the city of Charlotte, we're not presupposing the lifestyle people want to live, and so we're trying to design around a range of contexts that people can make choices. And so when you're doing good design, you're going to provide choice for everyone, and in one way that's sort of how equity is handled. But as it relates to the latter part of what was being discussed, it's sort of everybody has their role to play in contributing to or allowing improvements that occur, in their neighborhood. For us, where we're really seeing is again in the connectivity that we're a city that largely was built again around the automobile, and people love their cul-de-sacs. And if you are the person that lives on a cul-de-sac and you happen to be in a well-connected community, you've got the best of both worlds, because you can sort of play in the street, not have to worry about any cut-through traffic, but everybody else has to deal with what wasn't on your street. And so as we're trying to perpetuate rules that are about connectivity, I think inherent to that is the equity issue, that it only works if everybody does it. And the instant you start deciding who are winners and who are losers, you've really just kind of undermined everything you're hoping to accomplish.
If I could just add one more thing, funding and implementation is real important to equity. Historically, bikeways and so forth have gone in the well-to-do neighborhoods where, sort of the the creative class folks are, more into the bicycling thing, and we've forgotten some of the working class neighborhoods where people actually bicycle out of need. And so we've kind of shifted our strategy. I know in the city of LA, we're really pushing to put some of the bicycle facilities now in the more low-income neighborhoods.
The other thing I would say about equity that if done right, these kinds of projects get you into is because you're dealing with the land use side of things as well. And I think that a good complete streets project leads to really it being an economic redevelopment strategy as well. So that gets you into the equity issues of gentrification, both for businesses and for housing. So it really does bring to bear equity issues in a way that transportation folks aren't always aren't used to dealing with. It's more of these modal things and noise impacts and air quality. Those things we've become more attuned to in the transportation world, but because it gets you into economic reinvestment, it brings in the gentrification issues.
Any other hands in the air? Can I get somebody who has to ask a question? All right. Second round.
Any comments on access management? Like, Mike, we're at a local street meets a state highway or something. Do your all's access management guidelines kind of correspond? How do you resolve any discrepancies? What contributions can good access management make to the public right-of-way and private property intersect?
Kind of coming from a traffic engineering background, I had a lot of training in the role of access management, and it sort of works from this notion that you want to, it's never said this way, but it's sort of like consolidate all your access into a single point. The fewer access points you can have, the better. Intuitively, I've never accepted that, because great places, there's access occurring somewhere, and oftentimes the worst thing you can do is have too much of it concentrated in one point. So we sort of know on one end of the scale, too much access is a bad thing, and on the other end of the scale, it also doesn't work. And so we didn't really try to overly regulate in terms of what we've written on access management, but we know that as we're trying to achieve connectivity at the local level, which means from the state perspective, more access, because they'll look at our local streets as driveways on their system. We kind of had to find this compromise, and we kind of almost came to a truce about it, where we said, hey, rather than let's agree to what are going to be the engineered rules on this, let's look at it like this. Connectivity is a good thing, and we could all get people to kind of nod our heads, yeah, that's what we want. And so if we're ever on a facility that the state says this is, for example, in North Carolina, they have something called strategic highway corridors, which are the things that link, major economic, centers across the state. So if we're ever on one of these very important routes, we'll concede that, our connectivity may look like too much driveways, from you all's perspective, that we'll say that that is a safety provision, we're willing to yield on that. And so we wrote in sort of at the beginning of the ordinance where no developers would go looking for it necessarily, that if we ever felt the need to yield on the basis of safety, that we could. And so the ordinance would give way to some other, in this case, state requirement. So that's a long way of saying my philosophy and approach was let's not overly regulate it, get some good principles down about, being around traffic signals and, certain operational things that do matter, but let's not, be so rigid as to say this is the number per some distance and worry about that too much. Because again, in my experience, good places, it happens more organically if you've gotten other things right.
I think one thing that you don't want to do is have streets or highways running through cities that are barriers to cross. And they split neighborhoods. And so that's kind of been what the result of a lot of sort of the state highway mentalities running through a city. We don't want anybody crossing this. We don't want anybody. They become barriers to neighborhoods. And it also gets to almost sort of flattening the hierarchy of your street network a bit so that, people from side streets can cross, and you need frequent crossings. Think about it's a kid living in a neighborhood that needs to get to school that happens to be on the other side of that street. How far do they have to walk to get to a place where they can cross? Where a senior citizen that needs to get to, a senior center or a store or anything like that, you don't want to have these things be so big and difficult to cross and infrequent crossings that, like I said, they become barriers to neighborhoods. So I say you put more crossings in and have the side streets kind of sort of raise up in the hierarchy a little bit.
No, I moved locations. I asked a question earlier.
Seats the floor. This is a question for Mike. What do you, having heard about all these kind of new manuals and guidelines coming out, what do you think the real need from a traffic engineer's perspective is that hasn't been filled yet?
It's a good question. Strictly from a traffic engineer's perspective. I kind of alluded to it a little bit in my presentation. I kind of talked about how the software really hasn't kept pace. What I sort of find some passion about is that engineers frequently get criticized for, thinking too narrow. And what I sort of come back with is sometimes no one's ever really communicated effectively what the problem is we're trying to solve. That it's not that it's narrow thinking. We've been trained around a curriculum that's about solving a problem no one's trying to solve anymore. And so, a lot of the presentations have been about rewriting manuals and throwing out old rules and things. And I don't think it's about an intrinsic tendency of an engineer to not sort of be able to think broadly. It's just we've got to decide what is the problem we're trying to solve. And so, sort of reflecting back on the software part of it, that stuff was written to deal with a whole way of solving a problem that I think this room is saying, no, that kind of created the problem. We're designing intersections around the worst moment of a day that creates problems for the rest of the day. And so in terms of work that still needs to be done, people need to buy into the concept, first of all, that it's not an imperative or a mandate that you provide certain levels of standards or level of service for signalized intersections, and if you can embrace that philosophy, there's still a need to develop tools and ways of saying, well, we're not trying to throw it away entirely. This is still a place where lots of people want to get around in cars, and that has its role too. How are we going to find a happy medium? So I think there's work to be done there.
And I completely agree with him. What's the problem? For 50 years, transportation engineers were told that their problem was to move as many cars as fast as possible, and they did a pretty good job. They have an extremely valuable skill that we need to apply in a different way. And when we tell them that their job is to create healthy, livable communities where people can bike safely and can walk safely and people of all physical abilities can get around safely, they're going to do a pretty good job, but they need to be told that that's their new assignment.
Let's wrap up. As a way to wrap up, I will defend engineers. I will now defend engineers. I've spoken to many who your level of service, your 15-minute peak, and yes, that's kind of in the old manual, and yes, there's a software which which deals with that. But oftentimes the political environment is all about we can't have congestion. And we can't have, and people honk their horns, and these are the people who get frustrated and write letters and call their politicians, and those are the loud voices. And so the guy if we're telling them, we're saying, well, we need a little bit more congestion, and we need better, that we need these roundabouts with these traffic signals, so these people with limited vision can cross the street, and then you saw the tailback. And, all those people are on their mobile phones calling up City Hall saying, they're tweeting about this roundabout that's got all this congestion. And they're having to wait 30 seconds. And so if you're asking the people who are in charge of traffic, they get the phone call from the mayors. And this happens all the time. And, I work all around the world, and every place I work has the worst traffic ever. So we need to, as the body politic of the pedestrian and cyclist professionals, we need to enlarge the political space to allow good street design and allow good street engineering and to allow different engineering. And that enlargement of the political space is stuff like Janet's video about, well, this is why it's backed up. Or there's other videos about, the threat to society's cul-de-sacs. And here's how the community can understand what a chicane is. It's not chicanery, it's a traffic calming device. And so that's why I showed some of these videos. This is how you enlarge the political space so that we can better operate.